Welcome to the Open Apple podcast, where we celebrate the Apple II. Whether you're a long-time user, a nostalgic visitor, or a newcomer to the community, join us as we share news and memories of Steve Wozniak's most famous personal computer.
Hello and welcome to Open Apple. This is episode 57 for March 2016. I am your co-host, the first, Quinn Dunkey, and with me as always is co-host the second, Mike McGinnis. How you doing, Mike?
Insert golf clap sound effect here. Yay, I'm here. Woo.
Was that an edit point, or are you just being an idiot?
No, a little of both. I haven't decided yet.
Yeah. Good.
How are you, Quinn?
I'm doing well. I've been very busy lately, but carved out a little bit of time to play with some retro gadgets, as we'll be talking about later.
Great.
And of course, I'm very excited about our interview today.
Yeah, this is definitely a coup, and it's all because you're internet famous now. That's how you contacted him.
Sure.
Well, we've been trying for quite some time to get him. Well, I mean, if you downloaded this podcast, you already know we're talking to Bill Budge today. So I don't know why I keep saying him secretively or something. But so we've been trying for a while, and no response. And then your post went viral, and suddenly he's available to us. Yay!
Yeah, I think that was probably a coincidence. I actually worked at the same company as Bill a few years ago, and so he remembered me. And mainly it was just I think a case of he's a busy guy, and
sure, yeah,
we all have different methods of communication that we pay more and less attention to. So we found the one that worked, and he was happy to do it. So. Just a case of finding a window, and unfortunately, before our listeners get their hopes too high, wow. So, I'm no podcasting expert, but I have never seen that much trouble with Skype and all of our software and stuff before. Has it ever been that bad for you?
No, that's definitely one for the books. Bill doesn't normally use Skype. We'll pull back the curtain here a little bit, and he had a very old version installed. And I guess when he did the upgrade, because Skype is a Microsoft product and they don't know what they're doing on their own platform, let alone Mac, it didn't overwrite some files that it needed to, and so we couldn't get the three of us connected. I could connect to you, I could connect to Bill, but I couldn't get all three of us in a group chat. So we tried that for a while. We went over to Hangouts. That was even worse. So we came back to Skype. And then finally Bill discovered, if I just go and delete these files manually and install it, of course, he had given us about an hour because, like you said, busy guy and stuff. And I think we had burned through like about 25 minutes at that point.
Yeah, maybe even half an hour. Yeah. Yeah. So by the time we got everything working, the time was very tight. So there was definitely things that, more things that would have been nice to talk about, but we're really glad that we got the time that we did. And boy did we try, folks. That was amazing. At one point we had you and I in a Google Hangout, and I could see you but not hear you. And then
the camera up, and
you were literally miming to me. And then at one point you had Bill in voice, and I had Bill in IM, but like we couldn't hear each other. It just it could not have been more technical problems, and it could not have happened at a worse time. So
it felt like it was the Keystone Cops,
Yeah.
And of course, the fact that we were on a clock there just made things worse because I'm watching the minutes tick away.
Mm-hmm. That was agonizing.
But we do appreciate that Bill did stick with us for the rest of the time, and then he was patient for our follies. And hey, the good news is all that time that you don't get to listen to Bill, you get to listen to me and Quinn some more.
That's right. We're gonna fill that time, folks. Rest assured.
That's right.
And the icing on the cake, of course, is that we forgot to ask Bill to record his audio locally, which we normally ask the guests to do. So we have to rely on the Skype call recorder audio. So the quality isn't quite up to our high Open Apple standards. She says in scare quotes, but it should be a fun listen anyway.
And why don't we just get to that?
Yeah, I think we've had enough ado, as they say. So, Bill Budge, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm Lane Mooney. I'm a video game and computer historian, and you're listening to the Open Apple Podcast.
All right, joining us on the show now is the one and only Bill Budge, famous Apple II programmer, who all of our listeners already know. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thanks, Quinn. Nice to be here.
All right. So why don't we jump in with the first question that we love to ask everybody? Why Apple II? What was it about that machine that got you started?
Well, it's kind of funny. I was looking at a bunch of different machines, but in 1980, it wasn't all that easy to buy a personal computer. I was looking at the TRS-80, and there was one called a CompuColor. I had a really good friend, Andy Hertzfeld, and he had an Apple II, so I actually, was a grad student with him at UC Berkeley at the time. And I went over to his apartment and checked it out and really thought it was great, and he was doing some amazing stuff on it. So I put an order in with a store that said they could get them, and waited for a few months, and there was sort of nothing. And then I found a place that had them, a little TV store in San Francisco called Village Electronics, and finally got it. Had to take out a little bit of a loan from my mom and dad. It was about $2,000 for a minimal Apple II at that point.
Yeah, and that was a lot of money back then.
Yeah, it was a lot, and I had to pretty much immediately upgrade it to 48K. That, it was a couple $100 for 16K of RAM and a disk drive. The tape storage on a cassette recorder was really flaky and kind of annoying. I didn't have a tape recorder anyway, so I ended up getting a disk drive. Yeah, it was quite an investment, but in retrospect, probably the best investment I made in my life.
Yeah, I think that goes for all of us. So the sort of the first game that you're kind of on record for is one called Penny Arcade, right? Which was sort of a Pong type of game. Correct me if I'm wrong, but can you talk about the journey from sort of getting that Apple II to actually putting out that first game?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a long journey. The Apple II came with a red manual with a bunch of listings of programs that were built into the computer, and also a game called Breakout, which was in low-res color graphics on the Apple II. And so when I'd power up my Apple II and wanted to play with it, I would type that program in. It was fairly long, a couple hundred lines of BASIC, and get it working and play it. I got pretty good at that game, as you can imagine, pretty tired of typing it in. And after a while, I started thinking about ways that I could maybe make it more challenging. I got so good that I could play almost a perfect game, and that was boring. So I wanted to make the game go faster. And I started by trying to modify the basic code. And but it only could go so far. I could make it go pretty fast, but the ball was sort of jumping around. I didn't know how to do collision detection. And in any case, it wasn't really very interesting. So I got kind of interested in maybe making a high-res graphics version of it, because the low-res graphics was about 40 by 40, and the high-res was 192 by 280, and that was a lot higher res. And so I started playing with using the shape tables in the ROM to draw the ball, and it turned out that was way too slow. So, in using BASIC. So then I had to make a jump to assembly language and started playing with that. Half of the battle there was trying to figure out the mapping of the high-res graphics, how to map X coordinates. Yeah. So the documentation for that was basically look at how Woz did it in the ROM in assembly language. So kind of had to make a pretty big jump, although the assembly language is very simple, by today's standards, almost minimal, but it's kind of a big leap to going from programming in BASIC to programming in assembler and understanding the architecture. So I made a routine to plot, given an XY coordinate, plot a dot on the screen, and then I built a bunch of games out of that. The Penny Arcade game ideas came from Pong, obviously. Pong was a game that was fairly common at that point. I could see it. There was a pizza parlor near where I lived at UC Berkeley, and they had a Pong cocktail table sort of format game, and it was kind of interesting to look at it, and I thought I could do that. So I programmed something, basically a Pong game. That's one of my first apps that I'd written in high-res graphics.
Very cool. So then the next game that sort of the internet thinks you made was Tranquility Base. Is that true?
Well, so I made that Pong game, and I tried to make variations of it. People were saying, oh, you could maybe sell these. And I tried to sell them to various game companies. And it turned out that at that point, nobody really had any money, and people were willing to sort of like, well, we could try, but can't make you any promises. And finally, I gave them to Apple in exchange for a printer. And that got me excited. I could write a game a week, and a printer is like $700, and maybe I could make some money, but hadn't quite figured out how to sell a game. And Tranquility Base sort of came out of that. Yeah, I had this. I had evolved my graphics routines a little bit beyond like point plotting. I could actually draw very poorly anti-aliased lines. I didn't really know the right algorithm at that point, the Bresenham, which sort of distributes its error in a way that makes low resolution display rendered lines look pretty good. My lines were pretty ugly. But I used that to make the Tranquility Base. The lander had little line segments for the legs, and a little box was like 4 line segments to make a rectangle. It's pretty rough, but and then the physics of, it's kind of funny, but physics look so impressive. They're very simple, the math to simulate that. It's, by today's standards, again, a very low quality physics simulation, but doing integration in a very poor way, but it looked pretty good. And Space Wars was a game, one of the first games that I ever saw on a computer. And so it was kind of an homage to that, I guess. And there was a guy who'd been bugging me for a long time named Barney Stone to make a game that he could sell. He had a little software company called Stoneware. And so I made that game for him. And I think it came after like the other games that I did, though. The trilogy of games and Space Album, maybe kind of contemporaneous.
And then was the next sort of big one Raster Blaster, or was there anything in between there?
I think there was one other thing where I took my line drawing routines and some of the other graphic stuff and made a package called 3D Game Tool, where you could sort of do 3D. It was 3D isomorphic projection, not really. Division was so slow that I didn't try to do perspective transforms. Although some people ended up being able to do that. The flight simulator programs had perspective transforms. And I made a little space shuttle model by hand, plotting points and connecting with lines. But that was kind of a minor thing. And it turned out the biggest part of the effort for that was writing a manual to explain how to use the thing. I remember kind of cursing myself for the idea, because writing the manual to explain it took a long time, a lot of evenings. Raster Blaster was like, I guess, looking at it, it's really a quantum leap over my earlier games. I had kind of realized, by this point I was working at Apple and getting a lot of stimulation from other people and a lot of ideas. And one of the things I realized was that plotting pixels or drawing lines was, just really you couldn't get the most performance in actually rendering bitmaps. There was a routine that Xerox had in their Alto computers called BitBlit, which is basically drawing a lot of pixels at once. It's much more efficient. And Raster Blaster sort of built on that idea. I had written some routines to draw bitmaps, and they used those to draw the balls. And so it looks quite a bit more polished and more advanced.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely where we see the beginning of sort of more modern-looking Apple II games for sure. So from there, the next sort of reasonable step, the logical extension of Raster Blaster, was Pinball Construction Set. Can you talk a bit about what your inspiration was there and how you kind of went from A to B?
Yeah, well, it looks like a very logical progression. There were some difficulties. It's a lot. The Raster Blaster, the table is a database in memory. I don't use the screen contents to do collision detection. And the database was very touchy. The classic problems in collision detection are what to do, making sure you detect all the collisions, because if you don't, then you go through things. And the other one is, how do you react when you detect a collision? It's very easy to do the wrong thing and end up getting stuck to things because you're hitting it and you try to go away, but then you're hitting it again, so you reverse the direction and you end up just sort of like stuck. And the way I had dealt with these problems was not a very mature way. I just sort of tweaked things until it kind of worked. And that wouldn't work with Pinball Construction Set. So it was really, I guess my inspiration was, though, I didn't really want to make more pinball tables. It seemed not very interesting after I'd done one. And I was always interested in construction toys. I grew up with things like Tinker Toys and blocks, from a very young age. And I always enjoyed making stuff. So that was an activity that I could identify with. And I thought that would be fun for people to do too. No reason to think that, that people would be like me that way. But so I wanted to, and I could see the technology. I was very strongly influenced again by Apple, what I saw there with the Lisa computer and later with Macintosh, and all of the Xerox work that with Smalltalk. They had a lot of programs where you could build things. They had visual programming. They were sort of experimenting with all of these ideas. So I wanted to make something like that where you could create a metaphor on the screen of something that the user could manipulate to make things. And pinball, I sort of thought I knew how to do the physics. There were a lot of things that I had to figure out, though, like in Raster Blaster, the sort of shape of the board and of obstacles on the board was sort of fixed. But in Pinball Construction Set, I had to find a way for the user to be able to make shapes. And it ended up having to do a polygon scan converter. The user can make shapes that are essentially a bunch of points with edges connecting them to make closed polygons. And I didn't know how to scan convert polygons. That means turn the polygon, which is a geometrical entity, into pixels on the screen. So I had to find a graphics book and learn all of that stuff. UC Berkeley didn't have graphics classes at that point, and computers with graphical displays weren't really that common. It was much more typical that you would print output on paper, or maybe have a terminal with kind of a text sort of command line interface. So a lot of learning involved, but fairly clear progression from like a pinball game to like a pinball maker.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people appreciate the level of sophistication that was in Pinball Construction Set. Yeah, I actually had no idea there was polygon scan conversion and all that going on in there. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's a very classic, something that seems like amazing and different and difficult and impossible, but just a series of small steps technically for me. Kind of interestingly, about a year or two before I wrote that program, in one of my classes, we were given an assignment to make a calendar program for a microcomputer, and I wasn't able to get anywhere because there was this huge leap to sort of learning how to use this microcomputer, and then in 2 years to go from not being able to even write multiply subroutines to being able to do this program is kind of amazing, but just small steps. It's amazing what you can do with in the right series of small steps.
It's sort of like integrating your career.
Yeah.
So, Mike, I'm occupying the conversation here. Why don't you jump in with questions of your own?
Oh, I'm definitely enjoying the back and forth here. Learning a lot about some of my favorite early titles. I did have a question. This, and you may not even know the answer to this, Bill, but it has always occurred to me when I look at that flip folder for Pinball Construction Set, the art on the front of it with that two hands coming up out of the grid and the ball floating between them. Do you happen to know who did that artwork?
Let's see. Electronic Arts was just getting started. They had Regis McKenna was doing PR, and so they had the best people, and they found this ad agency called Goodby Berlin Silverstein. And they were kind of an up-and-coming agency in San Francisco. And I think now, they're all celebrities in the advertising world. They were very clever, creative guys. And there's a funny story. I had done my own package art for Pinball Construction Set when I had my software company. I actually sold and marketed it for a while. And I went... That
was Budge Co., right?
Yeah, Budge Co. And I had, I'd done some of the artwork, but I had somebody do the package, and it was quite a bit of work, and I was kind of proud of it. And then I went in to meet Silverstein. I forget his first name. And he said, "Oh, can you believe how amateurish this packaging is?" And they had ideas for making this thing like a record album. And it was interesting. I didn't have a whole lot to do with it. I guess I was interviewed for some of the copy, and I think Bing Gordon and Jeff Goodby were the ones who did the copy. And I think one of the interesting things that came out is I'm playing pinball, and turns out I'm not very good at pinball.
Yeah, as I recall from some of your early interviews, you didn't actually like games all that much. You prefer to build the tools to allow other people to create. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, games are incredibly addictive, and I have been addicted to games, and I have that kind of personality. So, but it does feel a little bit like, solving puzzles and figuring things out. That's kind of what I do in my day job, programming, and the problems and puzzles are a little more interesting and more difficult too, but end up having more real world value. But I totally get that games are fun, but I find a little bit frustrating, and I'm a little bit too lazy to spend enough time to be very good. So it turns out, I'm pretty terrible at almost every video game.
It's kind of ironic considering what a contribution you made to all the early gaming communities.
Yeah, it is. It's always been my dirty secret, working for video games.
Well, that actually leads nicely into my next question, which is about sort of my favorite of your projects, the one that never saw the light of day, the construction set. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in, I guess if you look at the logical progression, then the next thing for me to do would be a construction set. Well, what does that mean? Eventually, for me, it meant a visual programming language. And as funny as it may seem, I'm still interested in that concept. There are many, many, many attempts to do something like that, and some of them actually more or less successful in sort of niche areas, but still, to me, a construction set is really a program construction set at that point. How do you make something where somebody can put together pieces that then other people could use to put together things to make programs? So you could argue, yes, a construction set is C++ or JavaScript. And those are text oriented, which keeps out a lot of people. So for me, the problem of construction set is, how do you create a metaphor for programming that's more accessible to people who can't turn strings of text into the graphs or circuits that make up a program. Programmers are good at reading a string of symbols and then building the model in their head. And what is that model exactly? Well, it is a graph of things that are connected. And so the visual programming tools that you see on, if you do a search, or look at Wikipedia's article on visual programming languages, you can find, dozens and dozens of these things. In things like Unreal Editor or the Unity Editor, for instance, you can find little visual programming environments for things like controlling animation blending or AI state machines. So it's sort of restricted in domains where you can do this kind of programming. I'm still very interested in visual formalisms for making circuits or making state machines that would be sort of more widely applicable. If you look at, for instance, if you wanted to make an electrical circuit, a text representation of a circuit is possible, but nobody in their right mind would use that. It's much more intuitive to use the circuit, the graphical circuit representation. An electrical engineer can understand the circuit much more quickly that way. So something similar. And I think that there are possibilities. That's kind of my side project here at Google. I'm working on sort of a newer version of Pinball Construction Set as one project that actually has a much more powerful behavior editor than the one that came with the original, which is really a couple of AND gates and a few wires that you could hook up. There's some interesting ways to define state machines. And I think I have some interesting ideas for circuits. The big problem with circuits is that eventually the wires become such a mess that it's way worse than text. So yeah, it's kind of an example of making simple things hard and hard things impossible. It really doesn't bring anything, it doesn't help. But I think it's actually possible to have a graphical representation that can make things that could actually be useful for, real programmers. So that's something that kind of excites me.
Now, how did all of that lead you to MousePaint?
MousePaint was sort of like, another logical progression is I've got these graphics routines that, can do Pinball Construction Set, and my friends are building this a toolkit on the Mac that can make any program sort of have the benefits of this sort of advanced Xerox style user interface. And hey, I know a lot of tricks on the Apple II. I could do something similar. So actually, MousePaint was a kind of a two-package deal. One piece was MousePaint, which is a pretty obvious clone of MacPaint. But then the other deliverable I had, which was probably very foolish on my part, was to create a reusable library that anyone could use. And that turned out to be like 5 times more work than MousePaint, which if I just agreed to do MousePaint, would have saved myself a lot of work. Because then the routines could have been very specialized and only enough to do MousePaint. But instead, they kind of pushed me to do this general purpose thing that could render proportional fonts, text anywhere on the screen, and menus, all the blitting operations. Turned out to be a lot of work to get it all solid enough. I think only one program ever shipped with it. It was called Think Pascal, I think, which was kind of an amazing achievement. I think it required the language card, so it had 128K of RAM. But it was a complete IDE for Pascal on the Apple II.
That is amazing, actually. Yeah, I think MousePaint stands as kind of a real triumph on the 8-bits, just because of the sophistication of it. It uses that kind of modern GUI feel, and I don't think a lot of people realize how difficult some of that stuff was. The mouse programming on the 2C was very finicky, as I'm sure you learned, and just the difficulty of rendering in the high-res screen and so on.
Yep. And just getting a mouse to work on the Apple II was sort of a challenge there. Mm-hmm. The Apple II didn't really have interrupts turned on.
Right. So quick sidebar then. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about your appearance on Computer Chronicles, which we'll link to in the show notes so everyone can see it. What was that like?
So that was the appearance with Tripp and Gary Gildahl.
Yeah.
I barely remember it. Actually being there and doing it. It was during the time when Regis McKenna was running PR, and I guess his people made all these things happen. There were a bunch of things like that. But yeah, to be honest, I don't actually remember much about being on that show. I remember being on Charlie Rowe's show and how kind of computer illiterate he seemed, and thought that he really wasn't much substance there. I guess I was wrong about him. He's still around and widely respected. So I guess if he didn't understand about computers, maybe I judged him a little too harshly.
So when did you, in all of this, get hired at Apple? You'd mentioned Andy was a good friend of yours. Was he a part of that?
Yeah, Andy had started at Apple. I guess probably 1979, 1980, the exact dates. And he told me how great it was, and that made me kind of interested. And I had gone down there and tried to sell them a game, and didn't exactly work out like I described. So I guess I started in 1980 and probably worked there for 18 months, maybe.
Yeah, I read somewhere that you worked on the video for the Apple III at one point.
Yeah, that was the project that I was hired to do. It was the graphics drivers for the Apple III, and that was very different, I guess, than the Apple II, which was just Woz and a few other people doing this insane, low-cost computer with great capability. And the Apple III was kind of one of these projects where they bring in a bunch of people who really know how to do this stuff, and they kind of are coming from a world where they're used to more resources, and end up creating something that it doesn't really work all that great and is a lot more expensive. I think there were a lot of constraints on that machine. So my manager was a guy who didn't really care about performance that much. Just we had a spec to make 16-bit graphics. The Apple III had some extra graphics modes. I guess it had sort of like a medium res mode that had a lot more colors. The Apple II high res had this weird, it was really 4 colors, but they managed to squeeze out 6 if you could make some compromises and it was a little inflexible at how you could get those colors. But if you really focused on it, you could pull off some pretty amazing effects. But I guess they were trying to do it right with the Apple III. But I wasn't that into that job that much. Apple for me was just this amazing learning experience. The Apple II guys, Woz still had a cubicle, and when I started, he was still appearing once in a while. And there was another guy named Bob Bishop who was doing some amazing stuff with the Apple. He was sort of the master of the 2-day amazing tech demo where he would do like rudimentary speech recognition on an Apple II, if you can believe that, and speech generation. He did all kinds of crazy stuff, as long as it only took 2 or 3 days. And who else? Then there were, like I said, the Lisa people were there, so they were showing some amazing stuff. I never got to go to Xerox PARC, but I could see the influence and see how amazing it was. You see these very high-res displays with beautiful text and graphics. By today's standards, horribly ugly, but in 1981, amazing. So I got a lot of inspiration, and I was learning a lot just from everybody around me.
So is Apple where you sort of found your passion for graphics programming specifically, or was that sort of always there?
I guess I kind of discovered it for myself and kind of invented it for myself. Not that, other people hadn't invented it, but I didn't know about it. And it's sort of like just a lot of things in computer science you can kind of invent yourself. I had a wonderful teacher in high school who she was teaching us. We had an IBM 1401 that was not at school, but we could write programs on paper and then send them. And she gave us an assignment and just told us, here are the instructions that the IBM 1401 can understand. It's assembly language. And make a program to multiply numbers. She didn't tell us about loops. So I guess, I was allowed to discover the loop. I could discover that I could add a counter, and then I could test and I could branch. And that was very exciting. And then we had a basic computer. It didn't really have a stack or the ability to do recursion, but you could make a stack by storing things in an array. And so I wanted to do checkers, for instance, a checkers game. And so I invented stacks and recursion. They're basic concepts, but really great way to learn stuff is to invent it yourself. And then you discover, well, yeah, it's somebody else figured it out and better.
That's very cool. So do you still have your Apple II, or do you remember what happened to it?
Yeah, I had it up until a couple of years ago, and then I donated it. So it's in a museum.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I guess maybe someday I'll be stuffed and I'll be put next to
it. Maybe a wax version of you standing next to it.
Yeah, that's my wish.
Have you ever thought about picking up another one just for the nostalgia of it?
No, I don't know. It's funny. I'm not that nostalgic about, it was really a great machine and I had a lot of fun programming it, but computers are so much better now. It's, just when you look at the computer power that's available, like in your watch or, in your phone, I'm more excited about, computers being more powerful and bigger and the chance to do stuff that empowers people, more. You can write bigger programs now and design. I think there's some real opportunities. Some kinds of programs haven't really changed much in 30 years, like drawing or painting programs. And I think there's some possibilities for making them much more powerful for like regular people.
Yeah, very true. Well, Mike, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any more?
I think that's all I've got. Definitely. Thank you very much, Bill, for joining us today and taking a little walk down memory road.
No problem. It's always fun to remember these things and I just had a ton of fun doing all this stuff. So it's great to reminisce about it every once in a while.
Sure.
Fantastic.
All right.
Hi, this is Jason Scott, and you are listening to the Open Apple Podcast.
Okay, well, that was great. Thank you very much, Bill, for joining us. Again, it would have been nicer if we'd had more time, but, he had stuff to do, and we, didn't, but We do have some news to get to.
We do, yeah. Actually, just to let the audience behind the curtain one more time, the hoops we jumped through to make that interview happen. I was actually in the office, and I had to reserve a conference room, the quietest one I could find, and schedule a meeting and go hide in an office for an hour to record that show in the middle of the day. So, yeah, it was a big effort, but I'm glad we got it done.
Now, did you have to pretend that you actually weren't talking to anyone?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was, after all that, I was afraid of like someone coming in the room and, ruining what little quiet I could manage. And there was a noisy something happening in the room next to me. So I had like, the room I was in had a sofa in it. So I had the sofa cushions. I took them all and piled them all up against the wall to try and deaden the sound, which actually worked fairly well. So anyway, the hoops we jumped through for Open Apple listeners. All right, on to the news.
It may be old, but there's still news. Apple II news.
So the first item we've got here is our favorite blogger, Jimmy Marr, and he's been talking about my favorite game, Ultima 5. This is pretty exciting, isn't it?
It is now. Did the cease and desist you got from Origin? Are you even allowed to talk about this game? Don't you have to like pretend it doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think this is a gray area. I don't know. Yeah, if anyone
30
asks,
years later.
I was never here.
Okay, yeah. So Jimmy's of course one of our favorite bloggers, and he writes and writes and writes and writes and writes and writes about computer history and gaming history. And quite frankly, I don't know why this isn't a book yet, because his blog entries are just amazing and detailed. And every time I read one of these, I learn something new, even when it's about products and people that I think that, I know all the common stories, and I've read them in a dozen places a dozen times. And there's always new details that I was not aware of when I check out his pieces. And this time he goes really in depth with Ultima 5, and there's some neat stuff going actually all the way back to Akalabeth. So yeah, great article. Nice find.
Yeah, it really is. I've been watching Jimmy move forward in time with great anticipation for certain titles, and Ultima 5, I mean, this is the one I've been waiting for. This was without a doubt my favorite Apple II game, and gosh, I can't even count the hours I put into that thing. And I don't think everyone necessarily appreciates the research that Jimmy does for these articles. I mean, he finds these backstories on people, and the interrelationships between employees at these companies, and the behind the scenes drama that was taking place, and why certain decisions were made in the games. As a teenager or whatever playing these games, you just think, oh well, everything was sort of fell into place and they designed this game because it was the best way to design it or whatever. But then you read Jimmy's articles and you're like, oh no, that feature was there because so-and-so had a fight with their wife that day, or whatever, or there was this big controversy about this room in that dungeon that I didn't even think about at the time. So the backstories are really, really wonderful to read. And
if you're just in the mood for Ultima stuff in general, Richard Garriott, I think he sold it now, but he used to have that huge old mansion in I don't know, whatever Texas town he lives in. Mm-hmm. And every year at Halloween, he would have these open house Halloween parties, and you could wander through the halls. And of course, it was professionally decorated with spider webs and scary stuff jumping out at you. But as you walk down the halls, you'd see these, like there's the original box art of Akalabeth, or there's like one of the tapes that's worth tens of thousands of dollars on eBay these days. And so if you do like a Google image search, I think of, just like Richard Garriott Halloween or something, you can see some really neat stuff that goes right along with the stories that Jimmy's telling you.
Yeah, and there's also there's actually a tour of that house that Richard gave on YouTube, and he goes over some of the highlights. Like it has an observatory, and so he goes into all the crazy details of like all the elaborate foundations and steel work they had to do to make a stable base for the telescope and all this. And there's a secret room with like secret keys, like a puzzle room that like there's no apparent way in. It's like you can see it from upstairs, but there's no doors, and so there's this like secret passages and stuff. It's sort of exactly what you would imagine when a teenage boy gets really, really rich all of a sudden, I think. It's exactly the house you would imagine him building. But it is quite a place, I will say. One of the funnier links in Jimmy's article actually is to some, shall we say, controversial comments that Richard made in the press and subsequent follow-ups and so on. So I do recommend running down all the links in Jimmy's articles as well, because sometimes there's real gems in there that you may or may not have known about some of these personalities.
Yeah, no kidding. There was a piece, there's a thing in Ultima 5, as I recall, that at the time when I was a young Apple II using boy in high school, I remember that just kind of blew me away was that, there's always traps and puzzles and games like this, but in Lord British's castle, there's a secret room that you have to get into, spoilers folks, 30 years later, by playing a tune on the piano. And I just thought that was like the coolest thing to open that door.
Yeah, that was really amazing. Yeah, and I actually didn't realize this until Jimmy's article, but Ultima 5 was the first Ultima with an actual artist. So it's the first one that isn't just programmer art. And
oh wow, okay.
Yeah, and it really shows. That's the one where there's sort of an attempt at an art style. There's that sort of weird, not quite isometric, not quite 3D perspective on the furniture and stuff that they did in Ultima 5, which, looking back on it now, just looks sort of odd. But at the time, it was like amazing because you were just used to this sort of iconography for everything. And then Ultima 5 was where they started to make an attempt to actually make it feel like environments. And, you could see yourself in the mirrors and you could sit in the chairs and that was, that just melted my little brain at the time. It was really, really, really fun to revisit all that.
And this is one of his shorter articles. So if you just need a quick read, this is a good one to start with.
For sure. And if you're not following Jimmy's blog, this is a great time to start because he's already in the ramp up to the next big one that I think we're all waiting for, which is Wasteland. So go follow Jimmy already if you're not. All right.
Run, don't walk.
Yeah, moving right along. So the next thing I want to do, this will be a little bit of a sidebar, but I want to do a very quick review of a solid-state storage device. Steve Chamberlain over at Big Mess of Wires, sort of retro computing infamous for cornering the market on DB19 connectors, he's put out the Floppy Emu Model B, as many of us know. It's been talked about on Retro Computing Roundtable and a couple other places. But he sent us a review unit. So I've actually written a detailed review of it on my blog, which I will link to in the show notes. But I thought I'd also mention it just very quickly here. I have to say, in general, it's fantastic. It's a really nice device. It's got a great screen. It's got a really nice UI. It handles, as far as I can tell, every disk image format. It works great with 2C+, works internal or external. It's missing a few little things that like Nishida Radio's Unis disk has. The Unis disk, for example, remembers the last disk image you used, which I really like. So you can put Load Runner in it, and it'll just stay there. And every time you turn the machine on, it'll boot Load Runner. I like that quite a bit. This one, it boots into kind of a menu, and so the machine won't see it as a drive. And then you choose a disk image, and then kind of reboot. So it's a minor thing, but it would be nice. And the other thing that might stand out for Apple IIc users, the original IIc, is that it won't boot as the external device. Nishida Radio supplies a jumper cable that you can run inside the case, and you can do some trickery there to make it boot the external drive, which of course you probably want for a floppy disk emulator, since most of these, most of the software is expecting to be the boot disk. So. In any case, I would say definitely worth a look, especially, it's a no-brainer if you also collect old Macs or Lisas or anything like that, because it supports basically everything Apple ever made that uses the DB19 connector. This thing now supports. So, and the newest one, the Model B with the latest firmware, supports all of them at the same time, which is really cool. So you don't have to change from firmware or anything like that. So you just change a mode in the menus when you want to switch it. So
now. Did you have the original unit?
I did not. The Model B is my first exposure to it. So
okay, so you can't do a feature comparison.
No, although just from reading the differences on his site, it looks like it's. I think that he's definitely fixed kind of the major issues that people may have had with the old one. For example, the old one, if you had it in the wrong mode when you switched it from Apple II to Mac, you could actually damage things because there was a there's a pin that has to be switched. An input has to be switched to an output, and so if you're not careful, you could actually do damage if you plug it into the wrong machine. He's fixed that.
Okay.
The SD card is hot swappable now, which I think this is the only floppy solution I've seen that does that, where you can actually pull the SD card out, go change disk images on your computer, and put it back in, and just keep going. Which is, you don't have to reboot or anything. So that's really cool. And also, you can also write to the disk images, which not all of these things support. So, which is pretty important if you're playing RPGs and things that write to the disks. So this handles that seamlessly. It'll write to the disk images and modify them on the fly.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah, and actually, what I do like, one of my favorite things over the Unis disk is it doesn't have to convert the disk images into any intermediate formats. The Unis disk has to convert everything to nib files, whereas this thing will just whatever disk image you put in there, POs, DSKs, 2MGs, whatever, it'll just manipulate them in place in their existing format. So that's really nice. It's Apple II support came late to this device, so it took a little while to get a few of the kinks worked out. But I'd say it's really mature now and worth a look.
Great.
So Mike, you're finally doing some due diligence here for the Apple II community as one of the few owners of a Rev Zero Apple II, that certainly the only one I know, I think. You're finally doing some documentation.
Yeah, somebody asked me to. Easy for me to say. Someone had asked me to take some pictures up close, and I had. If you were at Kansas Fest 2014, you got to look at it. If you stopped by my room, then you could have taken a look at it, but I hadn't really taken a lot of good quality photos or anything or posted it anywhere. I had the video is still up on YouTube. We'll have a link to that in the show notes of what it does when it doesn't work. But there are fans of this particular, I guess, run of Apple II computers who like to look at the insides of this. So I took some shots, and of course, there are a number of ways that you can identify an original Apple II or a revision 0 Apple II as opposed to the Rev 1 and later boards, and so I thought it was important to document that. So there's a post up on the 6502lane.net blog, and following that I got some requests for photos of specific areas of the board and things like that I didn't have, so there will be a follow-up there probably by the time you listen to this.
Cool. Yeah, it's both fodder for the enthusiasts who like to debate the minutiae of this particular era of machine, but also, I think historically valuable because, there's a lot of debate about, when did they switch, from the green slot connectors to the other kind or whatever, and the more examples we have, the more complete that information can be. And it's safe to say that the Rev Zero Apple II is going to be the next most valuable Apple II once the Apple I hype dies down. So the documentation will help sort of, validate which ones are real and which ones are from which are early Rev Zeros and which are late Rev Zeros and so on and so forth.
One thing that's clear from looking at this mine, which is later in the run, it's and some of the earlier ones, is that the Apple II at that point was in constant revolution or constant evolution. There were a lot of changes that were being applied, even just across that initial small run. There were only about 6,000 Rev Zeros produced, and then there were, I think, 200 loose boards that were also sold. And yes, it's interesting to watch the boards evolve. My model is later in the run. It's serial number 5025. And so there are a ton of differences even between this one and, a serial number that's 2000 earlier in the run.
It's kind of an interesting snapshot of their manufacturing because, being the first sort of really real product the company had produced, the Apple I was just a hobbyist thing they built in their garage or whatever, but this was a real product. And I'm sure they were figuring out their supply chains and, figuring out how to source components, and I'm sure that they were learning a lot, and they probably signed up to some smaller distributors who couldn't supply the volume they needed, and they had to switch, and so I'm sure it took a long time to get all that sorted out.
Well, and even back then, Jobs was known for being secretive about what Apple was doing, and so not everything was documented even internally, let alone announced publicly, little changes and stuff. It's just that you would open up one of these cases, and you could, if you look closely, you could see, oh, there's a new pin over here, and now it's 2 pins because they're trying to deal with adding more colors to the machine, and or dealing with even solder masks and manufacturing techniques, and keeping track of all this was made even more complicated because if one of these, especially some of the really early machines were, they weren't the most reliable, and you would send your machine in to get it fixed, and it would come back with a Rev 3 board, or Rev 2 board, and which if you knew at the time was great, but these days if you open it up, it's sort of like, well, okay, now we got to figure out where this board actually came from because it doesn't seem to be matching the case that it's in. And because you would send it in, and rather than make you wait while they repaired your board, they would just put a new board in your case and send it back to you, and then that board would get fixed and put into a newer case. And yeah, there's a lot of confusion about some of these machines sometimes. So when you see them, especially like on eBay, it's really important to look for certain details. And I tried to go over some of those in the post. So yeah, check it out.
Cool. Yeah, I bet at the time someone who had their Rev Zero swapped out for a newer board was all like, woohoo.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like free upgrade. But yeah, now that same person would be like, no.
Well, that's the thing. Functionally, from a user standpoint, this is certainly the least functional of the Apple II machines. And so in 1978, this would be the one you would want to get rid of as soon as there was a newer version.
Yeah. Yes, and I bet there's a lot of people that upgraded to 2 pluses, which are now, basically worthless. But it might be sitting in an early case.
Well, and that's another challenge. Functionally speaking, the only difference between a 2 Plus and a 2 was the AppleSoft ROM. So you could turn a 2 into a 2 Plus simply by swapping out those ROM chips or back and forth. So it's important, to I think to keep a record or document known boards. So for people who are looking for answers about what they bought on eBay, they can find that somewhere.
Yeah, and I bet there's some interesting history there in the manufacturing and the supply chain side of it, because of course this being 77, 78, I mean the home computer industry didn't exist yet, so I'm sure the companies must not have thought very much of these tiny home computer makers coming to them asking for thousands of parts. Who knows what their financing looked like, or whether they looked reliable. You go to Motorola or Texas Instruments or something and you ask for thousands of chips, and they're going to be like, I don't know. Who are you again?
Yeah, there's probably, I imagine some of those big companies, they could see them coming. They knew who Jobs was, and just the eye roll and the sigh, and all the sales executives are suddenly like, gotta go to the bathroom, time for lunch break.
Yeah, it's interesting how all the companies, I guess, went about that different ways. Apple, we was all off-the-shelf parts, and they were a tiny company trying to do everything themselves. And meanwhile, Commodore were just vertically integrated everything, and Radio Shack, they just had the distribution and everything in place already, so they were already a big company, and they had, it's interesting how that all shook out.
There's a fascinating history, I think, and I don't know if it's actually been like collated and documented in any single source like a book or something, but especially about companies, the semiconductor companies like TI and National Semi and Fairchild and places like that where because the home computer industry scaled up so quickly that they found themselves in a position where they would take huge orders from companies like Apple and then scramble, and like the first batches that they would send out, they knew they were bad. They would just, we're still trying to get our assembly lines put together and stuff, but at least, hey, look, we delivered the chips. We didn't say they'd be good. Just hold on, and then we'll get the good chips for you here in a little while. And I think it was National Semiconductor that got themselves sued by the Department of Defense for exactly that. For knowingly sending out bad chips, which probably wouldn't, that's bad practice anyway, but these chips were in like missile controlled and fire systems and stuff like that. And, the company got sued and people got fired. But it's interesting if you read through the annals of those early info world and computer world newspapers to sort of follow along the events at watching Silicon Valley and the companies around it sort of scramble to cope with something that they just did not see coming at all.
Yeah, I think that Commodore book was it called On the Edge, something like that. I think that book they talked about it. That where one of their major suppliers agreed to a contract, and of course they're highly incentivized to do that because there's so much money on the line. So you want to get that paper signed no matter what. And they delivered really poor yields knowingly for the first month or whatever while they spooled up their fabrication, and that was a little sketchy.
That's what happened to the clock chip in the Apple III. Yay, Apple III. See how I worked that in there? National was having trouble scaling up to not just Apple's request, but all these other companies that they were skipping out on QA and things like that. And according to Dr. Sander, creator of the Apple III, National ended up with a contaminated line. All the chips had this contamination, and that's why the clock chips failed. And Apple didn't have another manufacturer to go to, and so they just pulled the chips out of the Apple III.
Yeah. I'm sorry, hold on a second. I'm just checking the pool here. Who had 27 minutes into the news before Mike would work on the Apple III?
There we go.
It's just Randy. Okay. Your check's in the mail, Randy. And even with the best of intentions, things went wrong. As the early and mid 80s trundled along and the home computer market really spooled up. I remember there was a big problem with RAM chips. There's a real shortage of those. Everybody needed them really badly, and so I think you see the designers scrambling, changing designs a lot there. Apple II started out with 12-volt RAM, and they went to the 5-volt RAM, and they're using DRAMs. Other machines are using SRAMs, but Apple used the DRAMs because they were more available. So the designs would change within the model line just based on the scarcity of RAM chips. That was quite a problem at the time, and especially the larger sizes. A lot of these early microcomputers, even if they had 64K, it might be in 2K chips, and so there'd be 3/4 of the motherboard would be 2K RAM chips because that's what they could get that year. Anyway, all right. Well, moving right along. I'm for all the supply chain problems that we had here in the U.S. I wonder what kind of problems they had in Eastern Bloc countries at the time. We've talked a few times in the show in the past about the interesting clones that came out of other countries that were out of reach of the then nascent Apple company lawyers. And, there's a lot that came out of South America, and especially a lot that came out of Eastern Europe, in particular Bulgaria and Romania. They had big IT industries at the time, and for whatever reason, well, I guess because the Apple II, as we said, was made from off-the-shelf parts, the Apple II was highly clonable, and so clone they did. One of our listeners, in fact, sent us this pretty sweet list of communist-era Eastern Bloc Apple II clones. So we will link to that in the show notes. That's thank you, listener Rob, for sending that along. Have you seen any of these, Mike?
I've not seen any of these in person. In fact, other than the Pravits and maybe the Basis or Basis 108, I had not even heard of a lot of these. In the 80s, of course, and the Reagan in the White House and the anti-Soviet, anti-communist rhetoric, and there were strict export controls for things like Apple computers, and so these Eastern Bloc countries had to make do with smuggling a unit in from the U.S. from a trade show or something, and figuring out how to clone it. And it looks like at the time Bulgaria and Yugoslavia especially are, kind of what China is now as far as making cheap knockoffs and supply and coming up with their own solutions. But yeah, this is a fascinating article. It starts off. There's a picture of a keyboard. It looks like it's from something called the Romanian HC91. The keys are just like decorated with green and red, and then there's, in addition to the letters, there's a bunch of functions on them. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that keyboard's beautiful. I really want to know what that thing is all about. I mean, I know some of these machines by name, the Pravits and so on, but I've certainly never seen one in person or anything. It would be amazing to have one show up at Kansas Fest. And you see the ripple effects of that. My long career in video games, I worked with a great many Bulgarian programmers actually, and other Bulgarians from similar related high-tech areas of these projects. And I think that's the reaping the rewards of this kind of investment that they had made in the 80s. All these Bulgarian teenagers grew up with this stuff, and it was such a hotbed of technology at the time. And now, they produced all these great, really talented engineers and other technologists. So let that be a lesson to our own country now that, hey, maybe we should be investing in the future as opposed to scaling everything back like we always seem to be doing.
There's an interesting, like as I was scrolling through this article while we were talking, in fact, there's a link at the bottom from ZDNet to a gallery of photos that we've talked about this Italian Apple Museum before, but I'd never seen, and I'd seen, I guess, maybe a few sort of amateur photos, but there's actually a nice collection of professional photos, like it's like a Macintosh Plus that's been stamped with Apple Cat for some reason. But yeah, there's some great pictures there as well. So some good stuff over on ZDNet to check out when you have a minute.
Yeah, and some beautiful photographs. So by all means, go check it out. All right, let's see. This next item I'm just going to skip over because it's really embarrassing.
No. So Quinn, you were you were interviewed by Circuit Seller.
I was. Now, to be fair, this is actually a year old. So
it is? Okay.
Yeah, I posted it for a Throwback Thursday on I think on the social medias. But it made the rounds again. In fact, they posted it for TBT, and then I think I retweeted it or something.
Oh, well, then never mind. Forget it.
Yeah. Wait. No.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
But yeah, it's just a recap of some of the stuff I did on building Veronica, which I've talked a little bit about on the show, making an 8-bit computer from scratch, and there might be some Apple II content in there. I'm sure I mentioned getting started with that. So yeah, anyway, maybe we'll link to it in the show notes, but
if nothing else, there's a couple of great photos of Quinn's work areas for the small, clean stuff and the big, dirty stuff, probably where she disposes of the occasional body.
We don't like to talk about that on the air, but those workspaces mostly look the same. The small, clean project area now has a crap load more Apple II stuff in it than in that photo because I wasn't full bore back into the Apple II yet at the time. So I'm in that room right now, and looking behind me, I see giant stacks of 5.25-inch floppy disks, and there's two C++, and there's 78 solid-state storage devices, and 2 different monitors, and the Apple II is absorbing that room as we speak. So, which is a good problem to have.
Of course.
All right, let's see. Let's get on down to Brutal Deluxe. It's been 38 seconds since we talked about them, so I think we're due. And Antoine's doing something very interesting here on YouTube. I'm not sure I totally understand this. Help me out here, Mike.
So I think, as by way of a quick introduction, we've try as we might, we haven't been able to convince anybody out there that we're the only ones that are doing Apple II podcasting sort of stuff. So we'll go ahead and give in, and we've talked about Chris, and we've talked about Option 8's their video podcasts, and there's another one that Antoine has done a few of. It looks like he's got 9 videos up now, and I believe that these are live cracking videos where he's got videos of himself cracking different games and talking about his process as it's being cracked. So pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, these are, so the ones that I watched, this is an interesting thing. He's shooting close-up video of the floppy drive while it's booting various protected software. And my understanding is it's sort of like a training course for recognizing copy protection schemes based on what the drive head is doing. And it's very interesting to watch, actually. For someone like me who doesn't know a whole lot about floppy disks and the intricacies of them, it's interesting to see how different everything is when it boots, and how some of the crazy stuff that the software does with the head when it's booting. So it doesn't mean a whole lot to me, but it's definitely interesting to watch. So yeah, check it out.
Definitely.
This next item is from Hackaday, and it's kind of neat, but also kind of sad. Every so often you see something in the mainstream or sort of non-retro computing community that's Apple II related, and you see people doing stuff that they don't know what they're doing, maybe. Well, they know what they're doing, but they don't understand the damage that they're doing. Let's say it that way. Random example from another field. There's a lady Ada who I like very much of Adafruit Industries recently did a video where she upgrades a Next sound box to play USB audio, and it's cool. But the Next sound box is really sought after and rare, and it's a shame to watch them get cut up. But
there's Jerry Ellsworth actually has a picture of I think it's the Zip 8000 where she's like melted the plastic down around to see what's inside it,
No.
And it's on the one hand, you're like, wow, it's really cool because now we know what's behind what's in this thing, but Jerry, why that chip? Sort of thing.
Yeah, that must be how Henry felt when he sent a transwarp off to get sanded down.
Right. I think he talked about that, yeah.
Yeah. So this is kind of one of those. Someone at a hackerspace found a Lego Technic control center, and this was the very first programmable Lego device. So Lego had this back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, had this educational arm whose name escapes me now. It started with a D. But they had this educational arm, and they made crazy cool products that you couldn't buy as a consumer. And why they decided to divide it up that way, I don't know, but schools could buy this crazy stuff that nobody else could. One of those things was this little electronics box that you could connect motors and lights to, and it plugged into an interface card for the Apple II. And as far as I know, it was only available for the Apple II. I'm sure Kevin Savitz will correct me if I'm wrong, but
or even if you're not.
Yeah. But someone came into this hackerspace with this thing, including the Apple II interface card, mind you, and both of these devices are quite rare and quite sought after. There are people specifically who collect weird Apple II interface cards like this, and there's people who specifically collect old Lego technology stuff. And, there's been a bunch of stuff since then. There's been the trains and, the modern Mindstorm stuff, and there was some other things along the way, but this was the very first one. So because of the thinnest of excuses, mainly that nobody could find an Apple II, and then someone had one, but it wouldn't boot for whatever reason. It doesn't sound like they tried real hard to get this thing to work the way it was intended. Instead, they tossed the interface card and proceeded to rip apart the Lego Technic Control Center box and wire it up with an Arduino, which just made me cry, frankly. So there's some pictures of them tearing this thing apart. It's a bit neat if you want to see what's inside it, because if I had one, I would not rip it apart. They did so destructively, unfortunately. They cut some plastic parts and stuff. So, if you do want to see what's inside it, there's some nice pictures. But you might want a stiff drink before reading this article.
And if you want to get even more in depth on the Lego Technics card, Alex, now I always pronounce it Lucchese, but I guess it's something else. Sorry, Alex, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Three different people have told me 3 different ways to pronounce it. He has an Apple II project blog entry where he goes into what this card is and how it's made and how you can wire up one of your own. So we'll have the links to that in the show notes.
Cool. All right, so moving right along, the last item we've got is it has been well trod in retro podcasting circles, and it's not strictly Apple II.
It's on Boing Boing, yeah.
Yeah, it's not strictly Apple II related, and Retro Computing Roundtable and others have talked about this, but I just can't not mention this because it means a lot to me personally. So, of course, we're talking about the classic Usborne children's computer programming books, which have been released in PDF form to the public. And these books were just really, really formative to me. So I'm linking to the Boing Boing article because I think their coverage of this was really nice. They have some great images from the books that you will definitely remember. And these were the computer game books where they had, listings in them that you could type in, and they taught you all about how the different computers worked. It may not, I think they were less popular in the US, but they were very popular in Britain, where it was born is based, and they were by extension fairly popular in Canada because we got a lot of British stuff in Canada. And so the listings in them are mostly British computers. There's ZX Spectrum and BBC Micro and this kind of thing, but they did have Apple II stuff as well. So yeah, I grew up with these books, and I'm just the nostalgia bomb that I got seeing those images is hard to overstate because I had a couple of these books. I had the computer battle games one, I think it was. It had the fighter jet on the cover, and I had another one, the fantasy games one. And I mean, I wore them out. I carried them everywhere I went, and I typed these programs in over and over, and I modified them, and I picked them apart. And the area I grew up in, we didn't have a lot of access to computer programming materials, so these books were like a beacon in the dark for me, and I self-taught myself an awful lot of programming from these books. And what I love about them is how forward-thinking they were, how forward-looking they were. I mean, the gall, for lack of a better word, to teach assembly language to 10-year-old kids in 1982 is just it's amazing, the foresight to do that. So imagine how you might do that, right? You might design a comic book with cartoon robots plugging hex values into memory locations, and that's exactly what these books are. Looking back at the images now, I can't believe it. I mean, nowadays, we teach programming to kids through, Scratch and these other very kid-friendly programming languages. But here we're trying to, the only option they had was to teach BASIC or assembly language, and BASIC's fairly easy. It was designed to be that way, but assembly language, trying to teach that to kids, wow, just what a task they took on here. So the artwork is amazing. The books are amazing. So yeah, you have to go look at these. That's all I have to say about that. All right. Well, I think that's all the news we've got. I think we have a short woos segment, do we not?
We do, yes. Woz is sick of your shit.
We like Woz, and we know you do too. It's Woz News. It's woos.
He's posted, I guess, over on Facebook that he's, we've mentioned before that at least up till now, he would sign pretty much anything you put in front of him. I remember when he showed up at Kansas Fest in 2013, he and Randy Wigginton sat at that table for a good 90 minutes just signing stuff. So at the time, he seemed pretty okay with that, but not anymore. He posted on Facebook, quote, "I'm tired of watching my check-ins. I'm tired of people watching my check-ins and waiting to ambush me at events, in hotels, and in airports for autographs. You always stand and act the same and have the same photos all over the country. From now on, I'll say no instantly. It's not convenient for me, and we are not real friends this way." And then he follows up. I'm sure that there were some people like, wow, what's up with that? So he says, I forgot to mention that I sign a few, and they have a few more, and a big stack, and baseballs and Apple products, and sometimes one person wants 50 or more autographs, and yet they're not true friends or fans. Many may be incidental fans. I've been around people I admire and asked for an autograph because it is meaning to me, but I would never ask for 10 or 20 or 50 autographs to sell. Limiting it to one per person is fine, maybe even two if they have artifacts with stories. I'll never cut out fans from that. It's the money grovers that cheapen my values. When I speak, I often stay long after to meet fans who would love to just shake my hand and whatever. I did that for an unplanned hour last night in Toledo. I extended my stay for the same sort of thing, to let people in a special reception for sponsors or university staff meet me. Once I stayed for 3 hours to meet everyone at an event in Mexico City, but I'm tired of phony fans making a buck off of it. So there you go. You better be careful if you ask him to sign something for you.
Yeah, strong words from the Woz. I mean, of course, the Woz is known for not having much of a filter, and I think if you dig into his words there, what he's really tired of is people taking advantage of his generosity to sell stuff on eBay with his signature on it. So
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely would not hesitate to approach him if you have a treasured, Apple thing that you would like him to sign.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think that's a problem. And this being an Apple II podcast, we don't really talk about sports too much, obviously, but I guess that's a big problem for certain sports figures, where they get hounded by autograph seekers, which is fine. You want to meet your heroes and whatever, but a lot of these guys turn out to be, card store owners or just eBay types where they want you to sign everything, not because they give a darn about you or your autograph. It's just what it's worth to them. And there's two ways to approach that. I think in that position, you either sign everything, and so your autograph doesn't intrinsically hold a lot of monetary value, which is what Woz does, or you sign nothing at all. But and while that makes it easy because you just have you can say, hey, I have a policy that I don't sign anything. But on the odd occasion that you do sign something, then that becomes very, very valuable. So it's kind of a quandary, and it sounds like Woz and he may have just had like a bad experience with somebody and after a long flight or something. But maybe he's scaling that back a little bit, and who could blame him?
Yeah, and with Apple's continued prominence these days and the death of Jobs, I think he's sort of crossed a little bit of a threshold there on the fame scale, where now suddenly his signature increases the value of things appreciably on eBay. So no doubt people are, there's an incentive there to harass the poor guy now. So,
well, if you do have something that you want signed and you live, I don't know, halfway around the world, and you're probably never going to run into him, there is that signed by Woz thing where you can send them your item and pay him a fee, and he'll sign it and send it back to you. So there's that option as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was our long dormant woos section reawakened. I hope we managed to get the bumper in there.
Of course.
Since we recorded it, might as well use it. Speaking of dormant segments, let's go on to Weird Gaming.
You know Choplifter, you know Load Runner, but do you know this? It's time for a weird game.
So we wanted to try something a little different this time around. We got an excellent suggestion from a listener to do a weird game, and it's such a great suggestion. This is listener Tom. Thanks again for this, Tom. That I thought Mike and I should both play it and compare notes. And
so angry with you,
right? This thing is delightful and surprising and angering all at the same time. I had no idea this thing existed, so wow, I can't thank Tom enough for bringing this to our attention. The game in question is the late Douglas Smith's Miner, and it is the prototype for Load Runner. So I had no idea such a thing existed, and it does not appear to have been commercially released because
shocking.
Yeah, right. The disk image that we've got, it's full of debug features. You can just press a key to advance through levels, and then there's another key to give yourself, more men. And so it's clearly like a debug build / demo type of thing. And you can, without a doubt, you can see the DNA of Load Runner here, but it's terrible. Let's be clear about that. This game is awful. The controls are almost unplayable. They're so bad. But we'll start with the good stuff. The title screen is fantastic. There's a really lovely animation to open the game, and you can see the famous Load Runner font, which is very nice. It's very graphically attractive, but it's sort of fascinating. I mean, I would describe it as it's as though someone described Load Runner to an alien, and then the alien sat down and made it. Because it's sort of Load Runner-esque, but it's just all the details are wrong. The tiles are too small, and the dude runs really fast, and the enemies are weird robot things. They're not people, and the chests come back after you've gotten them, and so the level layout is poor. The physics are weird, such as everything about it is just a little wrong. So what was your impression of it, Mike?
I have some notes here that I took, and they start out with the words in caps, very beta.
Yes.
You sent me an email actually just a couple of hours ago as we were recording this that we should play this, and I went yay, and then afterwards I went boo, Quinn, boo. I didn't bother to make a disk image of it and boot it on a real Apple. I just played it in Applewin, and I was thinking that maybe that was the problem, but it sounds like you experienced the same thing that I did, and that's that it's half baked. It's the speed especially is like way out of balance. You move a lot faster than everything else that's happening on the screen. And weirdly, like the animation of your little guy is nice and smooth, but the robots kind of like they're there and then they disappear and then they appear in the block next to them and they disappear and then they, that's how they move. And, I couldn't get past level 2, except for once or twice because you're moving so quickly that it's hard to level 2 has one of those areas where it's like a multi-level dig where, you have to dig 3, drop, run over, dig 2, drop. And I had such a hard time getting 3 next to each other because you move too far and then you'd have to sit there and wait for them to fill back in. And so your little guy, he moves smoothly, but nothing else really does. Half the sound isn't there. Like the digging sound is there and it's really loud. But there's no, the little dropping sound isn't there. The little zap sound that it makes when you die isn't there. There's no between level, that sort of opening iris effect that Lode Runner has. And, I guess the final thing that really drives home that it's beta is when you're going through the menus, like you said, there are menu options that say, option to add additional men for testing. So it's sort of like when you play Lode Runner, it's such a visually unique experience. You know immediately when you see it on the screen what that is. There's no question. Yeah. But this is a reminder that the gameplay, if anything, is just as big or even maybe bigger a part of the experience because you just remove a few items and you tweak it just a little bit and suddenly it becomes this awful unplayable experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, for all intents and purposes, this is Lode Runner, but yeah, a couple of details are different. The controls are a little different, the speed's a little different, and suddenly it's just the worst game ever. So yeah, what kept throwing me was not only the speed, but the tiles are smaller. And I don't know if it's just that they're too small or that I'm just not used to them because I'm so used to the Lode Runner tile size, but what a difference that makes in the gameplay. The tiles being too small, it makes the game so much harder. Like you said, to those multi-level digs, hitting ladders is really hard. I kept falling off ladders all the time because I couldn't hit them. Yep. And then, the level design is really rough as well. So anytime you make a mistake, you fall into some pit, where you can't get out of and it's full of enemies, or, you get trapped in some area that you can't climb out of and you're forced to reboot and all these kinds of idiosyncrasies. So, you can see the germ of Lode Runner here, but it really makes you appreciate how much iteration and polish goes into a game like that. It's easy to think about Lode Runner because you look at the end product is so sort of self-evidently brilliant that you think, oh, this must just have sprung forth from, the genius mind of Doug Smith. But now you see, oh, okay, there was a lot of bad ideas that had to get worked out first to get to that. It's like we say, idea
a road between here and there.
Yeah, like we always say in the game industry, ideas are easy, executions are hard, and this is just perfect proof of that. And lots of people had ideas for games like Lode Runner, but it's the polish, it's the hard work of tuning the controls and tuning the level design that made Lode Runner good. It's not the idea or the design of it. So,
I guess if anything, I come away from this really grateful that Doug Smith actually did take it to the Lode Runner that we know and love today, because the game is completely playable as it is. He could have, just take those options out of the menu to like add lives and stuff and maybe add some crappy music in the background, and could have released this and it would have just been this thing that, would have gotten a few bad reviews and would have been forgotten.
Yeah, and there was thousands of Apple II games like that, where those games that you play 1 or 2 sessions of, and you're like, oh, this just isn't that good. It seems, I don't know, it's too hard or whatever. You just put it away and you don't think anything about it again. That's the difference, is that there's those extra hours and hours of effort to polish it is the difference between a seminal, genre-defining hit and just another forgettable, mediocre thing that you toss away.
Or even an arcade game like Elevator Action.
Wow, you got the Apple III and your hatred of Elevator Action into one show. You're in rare forms tonight, Mr. McGinnis.
I'm on fire or something.
But yeah, this miner thing it's an absolutely wondrous artifact, and I love that it exists. So
Yeah,
encourage everyone to go look at it, and you will appreciate Loadrunner even more for having seen this thing. And how often do you get to see a prototype of a famous game like this? And here it's been hiding on Asimov all along. Now, mind you, it's buried 3 zip files deep on Asimov. It's literally inside a couple of other collections, and then it's itself zipped up. So you might not have ever found it if not for listener Tom. So thanks again, Tom. But we'll link to we'll give you a link in the show notes where it exists, and you may have to dig a little bit, but it's in there. It's called Miner, and you will find it if you go in there a little bit. So,
and the other thing, like I've gone through a lot of stuff that's in Asimov with a fine-tooth comb, but I think like what threw me was because it's called Miner, my brain went, oh, Miner 2049er, I know what this is. I don't have to play it. And it's totally not that.
Yeah, I would have thought either it's Miner 2049er or it's any number of other sort of generic kinds of games like that. I mean, there was, not that game is generic, but it's sort of a generic sounding name. There's lots of 80s games with names like that, and
right.
It doesn't sound like much. So yeah, I'm not sure. I probably would have passed right over this and never even gave it a shot. So what an artifact.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, well, moving right along, we've got a tech segment as well, which is another segment that's been a little bit gathering dust lately. That's the side benefit of a shorter interview is we get to bore you with all of our old segments that we don't do anymore.
Fasten your seat bits and warm up your soldering irons. It's time to talk tech.
So I've been fairly busy with my Apple IIc Plus lately, and a couple months ago we talked on the show about how I had disassembled the portion of the ROM that makes the beep noise, because as we all know, the IIc Plus has a weird and incorrect beep. And I kind of went at it again, and this time what I wanted to do was change the default behavior of the IIc Plus accelerator. The IIc Plus defaults to booting into 4 megahertz, which was awesome for your AppleWorks and your PFS in 1987. But in 2016, when I just want to play Loadrunner and not have to reset and hold down escape and reset again every single time, it's super annoying. So I thought, let's see if I can fix that. So I will spare you the gory details here. I've got a blog post about it, which I will link to in the show notes. But I did manage to find a way to do this. There are a few ways to go about doing this, I think. Since my hack, actually, Antoine, of course, one-upped me and pointed out a better way to do it. He actually found some code that I had been looking for in the ROM and couldn't find. The code that actually checks the escape key for the default value of the accelerator. I wasn't ever able to actually find that code, but I went about it a different way. I just kind of reverse the state of the accelerator after it's been initialized. So the effect is that if you boot, it boots into 1 megahertz, and if you hold down escape, it'll switch to 4 megahertz. So you still get cool. You still get both modes, but the default is now 1 megahertz instead of 4. And if you want 4 megahertz as before, you just reboot while holding down escape. So I've got a ROM image now with that change and also the beep correction. So it's kind of my ultimate IIc Plus ROM, if you will. And I will be bringing that to Kansas Fest. I'm still determining. I may be able to provide those ROMs for people, probably at a small fee if anyone wants to bring their IIc Plus, or just bring your wallet and I can give you a ROM and you can take it home. I can't actually distribute the ROM code online officially because it is still Apple code that's copyrighted, unfortunately. Yeah, so I can't just share the ROM image technically. But if you're at Kansas Fest, maybe we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, we've been pretty fortunate here in this community that Apple has. I think probably decided to, so far anyway, look the other way on some stuff and just pretend that maybe we didn't do that, or, that this isn't out there. And we'd hate to provoke them into something that they look at and go, all right, we're actually going to have to take action on this. So
yeah, exactly. The Eye of Sauron has so far overlooked the Apple II retro community, so I'd like to keep it that way. But I will say I believe that my Ultimate ROM is out there if you look hard enough. I believe it might be already on the internets, but if not, come to Kansas Fest and maybe something will happen.
Awesome.
All right, let's see. I think that's all I've got. Mike, anything else you want to touch on?
We do have some feedback. Do you want to read a couple of emails, or should we hold that till next month?
Let's hold that, actually, unless I've got a couple here, but I think I want to save those for now, because I think one of our feedbacks might be a guest that we should have on.
Okay. Well, your voices do matter on Open Apple, just not this month.
That's right. We want to hear from you, but not that badly.
That's right.
No, in all seriousness, please do write us to feedback@open-apple.net or podcast@open-apple.net. We love to hear from you folks. And don't forget to please support us on Patreon. We haven't mentioned that in a while, so like public radio, we have to occasionally badger you very annoyingly to please give us your money so that we can keep doing this. So we'll have a link, of course, on our site to our Patreon campaign. If you like what we do and are feeling so inclined, throw us a couple of bucks. And that's all I've got.
Bye, everybody.
The first thing you have to do is have a big idea. And I spent 10 years thinking about the home computer market, and the home computer software market specifically, and it took me 9.5 years to think of the big idea. And the big idea is the software artist.
Actually, that's one of the appeals of electronic arts is I get to separate myself. I mean, I can all of a sudden have this pure existence where I write software at home, and I write it for me, and electronic arts sort of looks at it and says, oh, this is pretty good, we're going to sell it. And they go off and sell it, and they send me money.
I want to have the company known as being the best marketing company in the business. And I'd like to be ranked and compared with the great consumer marketing companies of all times. And I think we can do that over a number of years if we work at it, because we know how important it is to do good marketing. We know how important it is to support our retailers in a way that will make us successful. When we talk about software as an art form, what we really mean by that is our software is deep. It gives a big experience. There's a lot to it. There's a lot going on. It's very, very creative. All of the things associated with the word art.
It seems a little pretentious to me sometimes if I think of myself as a software artist. I mean, you really have to prove it, and I think I've been better than most. I mean, when I do something, I don't crank out 500 copies just for the money. I think being a software artist means trying to push the medium.
So I think that software is an art form, and it's becoming more and more artful all the time. And we're starting to see the kind of people that are really good at doing great software behave more and more like artists are traditionally expected to behave.
This has been the Open Apple Podcast. Subscribe to us in iTunes or visit us at open-apple.net, where you can browse our extensive catalogue of past episodes or read our blog. If you like what you've heard today, or even if you didn't, your comments, questions or ideas are always welcome. Send them to feedback@open-apple.net.